My name is Rebecca Newkirk, and today we're going to be talking about some of the differences between PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, and c-ptsd, otherwise known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I've noticed that a lot of my clients don't have heard of maybe both of them, but aren't really sure what the differences are, so I thought we'd talk about it today. So first, let's define post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's talk about what that is for a moment. Even though most of us are probably familiar with it, not all of us really know exactly what that means and what that might look like for a person. So if someone has post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, that means that they had an event in their life that is considered to be traumatic. And that can be a lot of different things for a lot of different people, and not everybody who experiences a traumatic event actually develops PTSD. One of the main differences and one of the resiliency factors between people who do develop PTSD and people who do not is having a protective, safe other person present who is there to say, this isn't acceptable, this is not okay, and you don't get to do this. So if we feel in the moment like somebody was there to stand up for us, a lot of the time that it can be a resiliency factor so that we don't develop PTSD. So if we do develop PTSD, there are a number of symptoms that we're going to be looking for. Many of us probably know about flashbacks and or nightmares. So that is when we feel like we are experiencing the traumatic event again. And that can happen at any time. It can last for different amounts of time. We might act as though we're back in that moment. We might know that we're not, but we still feel as though we're back in that moment. And all of those would be considered to be flashbacks. Someone with PTSD would also have what we call avoidant behaviors. And those avoidant behaviors are very specific. They're avoiding things that remind them of the original traumatic event. That's not always a problem. Like that doesn't always impede people's abilities to live their lives in the way that they want to, but sometimes it does. If they were in a crowded space when a traumatic event happened because there was a shooter or because they got assaulted or something of that nature, that may cause someone to avoid crowded spaces from that point forward. And that can be really problematic because they might consider a grocery store to be a crowded space, or they might consider going to the mall to be a crowded space. And that starts to really limit the spaces that they can live their lives in. And that's just one example. But avoidant behavior is specific to avoiding things that remind them of the original trauma. Someone who has PTSD might also have hypervigilance symptoms. So when I say hypervigilance, what that might look like is feeling fear when there's no reason to feel fear, and feeling distrustful sometimes when there's not real evidence or a real reason to feel distrustful. So that might look like someone who always has to have their back to a wall, someone who always feels like they need to check out and make sure that they know where the exits are before they go into a space. It might look like someone who just doesn't trust strangers or doesn't trust strangers who look a certain way. And it can also be someone who just doesn't trust, maybe a woman who's been in a violent relationship may not trust men, just kind of in general. And again, the hypervigilance is problematic because it becomes generalized. So they feel hypervigilant more often than they need to actually keep themselves safe. And they generalize it to stimulus that is not actually necessarily related. So just because you were in a violent relationship once doesn't mean that every man that you meet is going to be violent or going to be a danger to you, that kind of thing. So now that we've talked a little bit about what traditional PTSD might look like, let's talk a little bit about the differences. So someone who has PTSD, what we're talking about is someone who experiences themselves as safe most of the time, and then there's an aberration in that sense of safety. So something happens that feels dangerous, that is dangerous, and that really wrecks that person's ability to feel safe in that moment. So the treatment for PTSD, if we're going to paint it with very, very broad strokes here, one of the things that we're trying to do is support that client in going back into their own individual internal sense of safety. We want them to access that again so that they can feel safe more often. When we're talking about complex PTSD, really what we're talking about is someone who had a chronic experience of not being safe, usually because of caregivers in development, in very important developmental periods in the person's life. So a lot of the time we're talking about family dynamic issues or abuse in childhood. We're talking about never really feeling like you have a safe base. So you're probably already hearing one of the main differences is that with traditional PTSD, or what we're usually talking about when we say PTSD, which is that acute event that was awful and traumatic and really scary, that person had a sense of internal safety and then it got taken away from them. When we're talking about complex PTSD, that person usually does not have an internal sense of safety to go back to. So again, painting with very broad strokes here, one of the things that we're trying to do for people who have c-ptsd or complex PTSD is first develop that sense of safety. And once we have it developed, then we can support the client in being able to access that more and more often. But there are more differences between the way that PTSD in the traditional sense, what we're usually talking about when we say PTSD manifests, and the way that complex PTSD or c-ptsd manifests. And I actually find this to be rather interesting, and it's very important for clinical purposes, or it's important for your therapist to know this and for you to know this about yourself so that we can actually help you to feel better. So the first difference is when we're talking about hypervigilance, a lot of the time for PTSD, that might look like I don't like loud sounds, or I don't like being in crowds, or I don't like, having that kind of smell. Those things can all make me really nervous. And then if it's a dark alley, I feel like I need to check behind my back. I always need to know where the exits are, et cetera, et cetera. If we're talking about someone with complex PTSD, a lot more often that hypervigilance is going to manifest inside of relationships. It's going to make it difficult for that person to build safe, trusting relationships with the people in their lives, because the hypervigilance manifests as I can't trust anybody who's not me, because they never had that experience when they were younger of having somebody take care of their needs and meet their needs and really care when they were upset. One other difference that we're looking at when we're talking about PTSD versus CPTSD is flashbacks. So someone who has traditional PTSD or an acute traumatic event PTSD might have a flashback where they visualize themselves back in the moment. They feel as though they're back in the moment. They might react as though they are. So if someone hears like a plane go overhead, they may feel like they need to duck, and they may get transported back into an old memory. Someone who has CPTSD, the flashbacks are a little bit more insidious and they're a little bit harder to pinpoint sometimes. That person can actually have a flashback that's just emotional or just visceral. So their body might feel the same way. So if there's like a sexual assault or something of that nature, the person might get triggered and start feeling dirty or gross, or like there's something wrong with them, or just uneasy or unsettled. But they might not actually have the images or the intensity of the flashback that someone who has PTSD, like one time assault, might flash back into that moment with more, I feel like I'm back in that moment, I feel like it's happening again. But the person who has PTSD and maybe was assaulted many times over the course of their childhood or over the course of a long period of time may end up just feeling unsafe and feeling dirty and not exactly knowing where that's coming from. And that can be really challenging as well. So just to kind of summarize some of what we're saying today, when we're talking about the difference between PTSD and CPTSD, PTSD is usually when someone has a basically safe environment and they experience themselves as basically safe most of the time, and then there's an aberration and that person feels very unsafe in one traumatic moment or in one traumatic experience, and then that has interrupted their ability to feel safe in themselves. When we're talking about CPTSD, really we're talking about somebody who had a chronic experience of not being safe over time, typically when they were developing. And so this can be much more in the person's makeup of how they experience both themselves and their environments and the world. It twists the way that we see things a little bit more because it was during these developmental periods and we didn't really get to develop that sense of safety outside of that. So I hope this was helpful or interesting to some of you. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments. And you guys have a good couple weeks and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.